Museums Victoria respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands where we work, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and First Peoples language groups and communities across Victoria and Australia. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and their emerging leaders. Our organisation, in partnership with the First Peoples of Victoria, is working to place First Peoples living cultures and histories at the core of our practice.
Welcome everyone. My name is Shannon Forkhead and I am the head of the First Peoples Department here at Museums Victoria. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Melbourne Museum this evening for this special event, and a warm welcome to all those that are joining us online as well. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that Museums Victoria operates, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and to all elders and First Nations people with us this evening. I would also like to recognise and thank our media partners, the Saturday Paper and 7am podcast, who have supported this event. Also to Glenda and Leah, who are providing the Auslan interpretation for tonight's program. Thank you both for being here. Tonight's event is part of Future Forum's Ideas Shaping Tomorrow, a new series of monthly conversations proudly presented by Museums Victoria. We are at a critical time in history, living in an age of continual discovery and remarkable change. Humanity is facing an expanding number of complex challenges, with rapid advancements in scientific research and groundbreaking discoveries transforming the way we live, how we experience the world, and how we relate to each other. In this series, Museums Victoria invites luminary thought leaders from Australia and overseas to reflect the big ideas and important questions that are shaping our future. Tonight's event, First Nations for Climate Action, considers how First Nations communities are crucial but often overlooked voices in conversations about sustainability, climate action and environmental policy. In the lead up to the World Environment Day on June 5, our panel tonight will discuss the importance of First Nations knowledge in protecting our environment, sharing important projects and initiatives being led by Indigenous communities around the world to create a more sustainable future for all of us. Museums Victoria is thrilled to be partnering with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Civic Design Initiative Deep Listening Project to present this event. Deep Listening Project seeks to co-design technologies that enable institutions and communities to collaborate towards effective and just climate adaptation. The project is driven by a multidisciplinary team at MIT Civic Design Initiative, a research group in the Comparative Media Studies Writing Department at MIT, that aims to offer a unique platform to support new and continuing research that address some of the complex civic challenges we face today. The project works across the university, community, international government organisation partners, and was one of the finalists in the MIT Climate Grand Challenge. We will be taking audience questions this evening using the online Q&A platform Slido. So don't be coy, join the conversation. We're here to answer your questions. You can also vote on questions you like by liking them. To submit a question, simply scan the QR code on screen or go to slido.com using your mobile phone or other device to enter the event code, #FirstNations2305. If you're watching online, you can simply scroll down the web page until you see the Slido box where you can type your question directly in there. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our host for tonight's discussion, Bridget Brennan. Bridget is ABC Indigenous Affairs editor and has been a journalist with the national broadcaster for more than a decade. She was the first Indigenous journalist to be appointed as a foreign correspondent for the ABC and has worked as a journalist in Europe, Asia and the United States. In 2017, Bridget anchored the ABC's coverage from the historic summit which led to the Uluru Statement From the Heart. Recently, she's been reporting on the pandemic and the ways in which climate change is impacting First Nations communities. Bridget is Jaara and Yorta woman from Victoria. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Bridget to introduce our guest speakers for this evening and to begin the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Shannon, and hi, everyone, and thanks for coming out on a Monday night. It's not easy to leave the house on a Monday night, so we really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone in person here in the audience, but we've also got a virtual audience who is just as important to us, so hello to our virtual audience out there as well. And as Shannon mentioned, it'd just be terrific to have your questions tonight. We'd really love this to be as interactive as possible, so we might just bring that slide up again from Slido, so it's super easy to use. Have a look at the... we bring it, there it is. So use that QR code and yeah, please don't be shy because we have an absolutely exceptional panel tonight, a global panel bringing perspectives from all around the world, which is just terrific. So I will introduce our panel now. We've got Darren J. Ranko to my right here. Hi, Darren. Darren is from the Penobscot Nation and is an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Chair of Native American Programs at the University of Maine. He has a Master of Studies in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School and a PhD in Social Anthropology from Harvard University. So not too many qualifications there for Darren. And it's going to be fascinating to hear from Darren tonight. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous communities in the United States resist environmental destruction by using Indigenous science, diplomacies, and critiques of liberalism. Thanks, Darren. To my left here in person is Rodney Carter. Rodney Carter is a descendant of the Jaara people, like I am, and he lives in Bendigo in central Victoria. He currently works for our people, the Jaara, as the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Jaara Clans Aboriginal Corporation. A defining moment in Rodney's career was negotiating the Jaara people's native title settlement in 2013, which was just an enormous achievement. He's also he was a member of that negotiation team, and he's one of the foremost experts in cultural heritage in the nation. So welcome, Rod.
Thanks, Bridget.
And yep, bit of applause there. And also joining us, which is such a privilege, to Rodney's left is Associate Professor Marama Murulani, and she's the director of the James Henner Research Centre at the University of Auckland. Her research is dedicated to collaborations with Māori communities that prioritise equity. And as a social anthropologist, she focuses also on Māori groups and their unique sense of place and belonging in Aotearoa. Hello, great for you to join us. Thank you so much. So we'll have a round of applause for all of our panellists tonight. Well, we're coming off a pretty interesting weekend, aren't we, after a really historic election where many Australians made their voice heard on climate action and the climate crisis at this election, which is something that we hadn't really seen in a decade. And I wanted to get the perspectives from all of the panel tonight because here in Australia, climate change has been unfolding in front of our eyes. Unfortunately, we've had heartbreaking natural disasters over the past 3 years and of course over the past decade. Drought, fire, floods, just devastating disasters here in Australia which have made global news. But it would be really interesting to hear from all of the panellists about what you're seeing in your communities and what effect you think climate change is having on your individual nations, but on your nation as a whole. And I'll go to you, Rodney, first.
Thanks, Bridget. I think unusually for Jaara in central Victoria, 7 years on from our settlement agreement, I think we've been able to be a bit cohesive in ancient knowledge, our ancestors' knowledge, and how we can apply that opportunistically whenever it arises in a modern context. So if we think about the effects globally on many First Nations, Indigenous peoples. Largely, we're very displaced and fragile, and probably easily the most affected from climate change in our homelands. And the positive then for us, I think, as Jaara Wurrung and hopefully for other First Nations groups, is that we've been able to apply some thoughtfulness around how can we heal country, ensure we're trying to heal ourselves as people, and have the rightful place applying our knowledge systems wherever policy allows it, across governments. And that's not always easy, but I think that is a real significant opportunity for us in being resilient and trying to make the world a better place.
Do you think that Indigenous voices have been centred, and have they been heard? In the climate wars and the climate debate that we've had over the past decade?
Yeah, not immediately. I think we're still seen as a bit of a curiosity, a respectful voice to be heard in a speech at a public forum or conference. I think what's deep and what sits behind that, beyond the curiosity, is how we can bring ancient knowledge into this modern, highly disturbed and modified world. And we generally think, for all the cleverness of our advancements societally as humans, we're at this point, I think, in the globe where we're doing more harm than good. And that's not tolerable. And I think the planet is telling us that, the scientists are telling us that, and our elders are definitely telling us that. So I think the time is right for us now, and I say cautiously, it's probably too late, but we have to do something tomorrow, the day after that, because our cleverness tells us that things will get worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Darren, what kind of effects of climate change are you seeing in the United States and around Maine?
Kchiwalawan Gwegwe Dangakio, Natalawizi Darren Ranko, Winovskewi Wabanaki, Neheme Benage. Thank you all very much for allowing me some space there. I am Darren Ranko, and I just wanted to locate myself in Penobscot language on our landscape here in Wabanaki territory across was now called Northern New England, part of the United States, as well as Atlantic Canada. Our territory exists in confederacy across these locations. And I'm joining you from a place that we call Neheme Benage, or Turkey Hill. We have wild turkeys that circulate the property out here. So really wonderful to join you. I suppose, there was just a study, and this is really impactful on Indigenous folks here, that 90% of moose calves are dying because of winter ticks, which traditionally had been die off during colder times in the winter, but it's not getting as cold anymore. So moose is a first food for us. And the idea that 90% are perishing because of ambient air warming is a really scary fact. And this study just came out in the last couple of days. So I would say that increased precipitation, sea level rise impacts some of our tribal nations here. And the Gulf of Maine actually is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet in terms of oceans. And so it's a really, we see this sort of water and air warming. I would say, and I agree with Rodney, similarly here in the United States, as Indigenous people, we're not fully engaged by the federal and state governments. I do see, we do have First Nations folks in the Biden administration running the Department of Interior and the National Park Service. And I think that has shifted the discussion around Indigenous knowledge and our role in decision making at the federal level. But as many of you know, we have a struggle to define climate as an overall issue nationally, given our politics and given this sort of mistrust in science, which I know that is shared around the world as a struggle. So I would say, like Rodney, we are, when a study and it confirms some of the things that our First Foods leaders are telling us around the health of moose or the impact of warming waters on fish, this is a real state of alarm for us as Indigenous people. And so many of our projects around climate adaptation, land return, land stewardship are really oriented around First Foods. And so these challenges are becoming greater and greater over time. And so that sense of action is really critical as we move into this next decade.
Thanks, Darren. Marama, I'll go to you. What kinds of climate effects are you seeing in your local area and in the country as a whole?
Kia ora tātou katoa. Ko taupiri te maunga ko Waikato te awa, ko tūranga waiwai te marae, ko tainui te waka, ko Waikato, mania poto me Ngāti Whātua oku iwi, ko Ngāti Hikaero me Ngāti Puhiawe oku hapu. Tēnā rā tātou katoa, ko Marama Murulaning tōku ingoa. Hi everybody, my name is Marama and I'm from the Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I whakapapa, or I have genealogical links to a number of Māori iwi in the central part of the North Island, but today I'm coming to you from the North Island, from what we call Taitokero, the sort of the north of the North Island. And I'm here actually with my research group, my research team. We are a multidisciplinary research team, and we are actually doing what's known as a Marsden research project on the stewardship of harbours in New Zealand. And we focus on 3 harbours, the Whangarei Harbour, the Manukau Harbour, and also the Kawhia Harbour. And I guess some of the main issue for this project that is rising sea level and Māori family losing land to rising seas. Of course, when the sea rises, you don't only lose land, but you also lose a really important food source. There are many kaitiaki, we call them. That's the Māori word for guardian. And they haven't just started because looking after their harbour environments because of this national call to action, but they've been doing it for many, many, many generations. So this suddenly realising that climate change is a real thing for the world. Māori have always been in a space of looking after, protecting, having that reciprocal obligation to pass on lands and beautiful environments for future generations of Māori. So thank you, Belinda.
And are Māori voices prioritised in the media and in policy? On this issue specifically?
I think, well, I guess we have an advantage in New Zealand. We have many Māori politicians in government, and we also have many policies where Māori terms are actually, used in policies and also in legislation. Now we have the Treaty of Waitangi, which is an agreement between the Crown and Māori. So we actually do have a stronger voice, and we have a concept of taiao, which is the environment, and this obligation to make sure that there is a place for Māori in the future, that has always been at the forefront of our ancestors, and we carry on and we force the government to listen to us, and we do it in multiple ways, and having all of those Māoris in Parliament now makes a big difference. Also, we Māori is a is the language of this country, and just having it on the radio stations and just in the everyday, it means that we have a force and we have us tools to work with in order to make sure that we are present in the decision making of this country. I wouldn't say it's absolutely perfect, but you know, we certainly have made a lot of we've certainly achieved a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite incredible to hear from our context. Well, as Darren just mentioned, first foods are under threat from climate change and from global warming. Rodney, this is a passion of yours. I love that term, first foods too. I think we should adopt it here in Australia. How do we resist, as Indigenous people and on our nations, is growing new sources of food and new agreements? What sorts of things can we do to be forward-looking as we address this crisis?
Yeah, I think for Australia and Central Victoria, like that's our homelands, it's been so severely modified, and there's just very isolated remnant vegetation. So those old ancestors, the knowledge trees, pockets of country, you could still see more clearly spirit in there. And it's not that all country still doesn't have that spirit, but when it's just been sort of wiped clean, and you have modern agriculture brought in, there needs to be a new way to do things. So for us to, in agricultural environments, put kangaroo grass as a native seed, as an ancient grain back into landscape, and it's still a form of monoculture, but to have one of our beings as such, that grass back in place that is beautiful in its stature, it's deep-rooted, so it's taking moisture in a profile, that's courteous of the other plants that need to survive around it. It shelters and shades the soil and allows the organisms to grow and be healthy again, the invertebrates, the insects, the birds, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. So that's then potentially a cereal that can be stripped for giving profit to country that might need more of this spirit and that plant for human consumption. It's a plant that's tolerated ice ages, the creation and living of my people on country for 60,000 potentially years. So we think bringing some of our ancient knowledge and using some of the best of what technology's got can be useful. I think what underlies all of that is don't colonise us again. Don't dispossess us of this knowledge. Don't dispossess us of this opportunity, given that you already own and have taken our land and strangely, our water. So I think there's a more sophisticated, mature discussion around this where we can reclaim things that our ancestors weren't respected for, and they deserve respect and didn't get it. It's never too late to do that for their descendants.
Darren, I see you nodding there. Are there some parallels with how your people are fighting back on your lands?
Yes, absolutely. And, I will say before I turn to a slightly more positive development, the state of Maine in 2012 basically created a takings against our water. So my tribal nation's called the Penobscot Nation. The Penobscot River is our first ancestor. It's our first relation. And the state of Maine made a new claim, which the courts have supported here, to the main stem of our river, which is really our lifeblood. And that bodes. We have treaty protected fishing rights, but this claim towards the water itself poses a real threat moving forward. So I think that is, don't colonize us again. It feels very much like that. So I think the ways that we are fighting against this, though, in building in relation with, in particular, land trusts and conservation groups, which have traditionally been, a colonial force. They have supported policies in the past, excluding us from our ancestral territories and accessing our first foods and traditional foods. In land protected areas in Maine make up about 23% of the total land mass of the state. So we have been in the last 3 or 4 years working with land trusts and conservation groups to engage in more access to our foods and in terms of gathering, and in terms of a whole host of kind of engagements, depending upon which group and where, as well as been enabling elements of land return. Land trusts have been helping us return thousands of acres of land into our control as First Nations. And it cuts to the quick of what Rodney was saying, that our traditions of management and stewardship, unlike land trusts, are actually are ones of engagement, are ones of relationship. As humans to non-humans, we have roles and responsibilities. So when we pick sweetgrass, which is a medicine, and we use it in basket making, it's our responsibility to pick it, and it's one of these rhizomatic grasses that when you pick it, it returns more plentiful the next year. So when it goes unpicked, it starts to die and fall away from the landscape. So there are so many examples of that in terms of our engagement, responsibility, and stewardship, that because of opening up territory with land trusts, we're building a more vibrant set of ecosystems, because as Indigenous people, we are engaging in these practices.
Marama, I've heard you say that your rivers that are precious to you are like the highways of... Oh, can you hear me there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard you say that the rivers that are precious to you and your people are like the highways of life. Talk to us about the stewardship you have over those rivers and what they mean to you, and going forward, what it would mean to lose some of that due to climate change.
Okay, so are you referring to my work, my book? I guess you are. Anyway, I live in the Waikato region, where we have what is known as a tupuna awa, which is the longest river in New Zealand, 426 kilometres long, probably not as long as some of the rivers in the United States, but it is a lifeblood for the country. And many Māori tribes live along that river, or awa as we would call it, and we refer to it as a tupuna awa, or our river ancestor. And that river, with climate change, is going to flood at times, and it is also going to, experience drought. And so we are the kaitiaki of that river, people from Waikato, that's our iwi. And there are many marae, or communities, that are along that river. We have a saying, he piko he taniwha, he piko he taniwha, Waikato taniwharau, which means at every bend of the river a chief, at every bend of the river a chief, Waikato of 100 chiefs. And what that whakatauki, or that saying, is referring to is the responsibilities that every single community along that river has to ensuring that the river is flowing and that it is as clean as possible, and that the other creatures living in the river have a home. And so that study that I did 10 years ago was probably the first big piece of research I did. It was actually, no, it was longer than that. It was much longer, 17 years ago. That was my PhD research. And because back in those days, when I was doing anthropology anyway at the University of Auckland, they weren't very open to Māori methods or Māori tikanga as being part of the anthropological method. And so I took a risk and I did things my way, and they've paid off now, because Māori methods are very much a part of of the discussions around climate change in New Zealand at the moment. And we have, we have a historical.
We might have lost Marama there. Maybe I'll just go to the next question.
The way
Back.
The next question.
We just lost you there. You just froze for a moment. So we might pop to the next question. Actually, we're getting some great questions from the audience. So I might go to Darren on this one because I love this question. How can Western societies learn from First Nations people about being good ancestors? And I suppose what that person means is custodians for the environment. How can Western societies learn from our societies, Darren?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And FYI, my household is waking up, including my. We have 4 dogs, so if you hear barking, it's just the waking up part of our day. I think that there is so much, and it centers a couple of things. It means that we can no longer treat Indigenous peoples as just a diversity quotient or a lovely speech. I think our leadership and decision-making roles are critical to this. So our research methods that Marama talked about. So much of our work centers not only our knowledge systems, which I consider as so critical to understanding the rate and important changes coming through climate, and centering our knowledge systems requires centering our research methods, which very much center future generations. There's so much commonality in Indigenous perspectives in valuing a 7th generation logic, that our responsibility to the 7th generation, but to non-humans in and of themselves, to the river itself, as Marama talked about. And I think, so that's the lesson, right? It is thinking long-term. It is thinking about, a kind of source of creation for non-humans and treating them as relations, and thinking about that 7th generation while mobilizing, and I think this is very important, mobilizing the Indigenous notions of decision-making. Only so much can be done just thinking about climate impacts into the next 20 years. We need to recenter and redesign the civic culture and frameworks of decision-making. And I think Indigenous leadership is so critical to that, given our roles and responsibilities across our landscapes.
Absolutely. Marama, I might get your perspective on that. How can Western societies learn from Māori, for example?
Well, I mean, the thing I'm doing at the moment, which I'm most proud of, is the research project we have is all about creating more scholars, more Māori scholars that have capability and capacity. And for me, that is transformative. So the project we're doing has Māori master's students and PhD students working with their communities around climate change issues. And so they get in there firsthand, and so who have a passion for their home communities and who also have an obligation to their communities. And I think that is transformation, by creating this new group of young Māoris that have a voice, that really care about the environment. To me, that is the way that we can really make change. Instead of trying to go and have, trying to actually go and have arguments with companies that don't really want to change, it's actually by creating a whole lot of new, young, up-and-coming, vibrant, committed scholars who will, push the kaupapa in their own, will push the voice of the environment in their own communities. And for me, that is the thing that I'm most proud of, and that is the thing that I think Indigenous scholarship really needs, is that it needs to have a legacy of people that will champion it.
Absolutely. I love that. That's just an incredible insight. Thank you. I've got a question for Rodney here from someone in the audience. Should non-Indigenous farmers plant first foods to benefit the land, or should they not profit off Indigenous knowledge?
I think they should plant our native plants. I think they should profit, but they shouldn't profit at our expense. So I think there's a unique opportunity to reset this whole idea of the appropriation of our knowledge of our country, and I think there's business models around being able to do that. There's property right protection for knowledge now, so it's inexcusable that it can't be done. Unusually for the Jaara Wurrung, we've realised that too easily things get stolen from us if we aren't in commanding positions. So part of us is to be in a really powerful commanding position with kangaroo grass, so that we can be in a position like our ancestors did, gift to others, gift to country the profit, and hopefully that these inappropriate behaviours of others that our ancestors have seen, what some people are doing today, they fall by the way, and maybe as a better community, as a holistic community, better than ever, we hold these inappropriate behaviours to account, and we regulate it because it's the right thing to do. And my values that I've inherited from my ancestors, extremely good values. The totemic connection to species, this idea of healing country, healing people, and shout out to Ollie Morass and us working on a renewable energy strategy and climate changes. We want to heal climate. So we're trying to do these things in unusual ways that mightn't be easily understood to others. But one thing that's really sound, our knowledge is really useful, and others just need to reach out to us and want to collaborate with us.
Well, I've got a question for you, Darren, from Rob in the audience. We have a reasonable acceptance of climate science and projected impacts at 1.5 degrees warming, unfortunately. How are you developing adaptation plans to maintain your culture? How is adaptation working?
Yes, it's such a great question, and a really critical part of our current work here is supporting, here at the University of Maine, supporting the development of adaptation plans by the tribal nations here. And it's, we have inspirational tribes that have done this work longer than we have, and especially on the west coast of the United States and Canada. They have taken on some real leadership in developing not only the plans themselves, but how to do the plans, going back to our research methods and the training of Indigenous people to be the leaders through this work. And so we've developed some climate baselines, and we've done a number of listening circles and engaged in Indigenous research methods to come up with climate adaptation priorities, as well as looking to traditional methods of stewardship and land management that will help us gain access and develop resources for future generations. So critical piece of that, it all comes together. It is the land access, the climate, and then the first foods. There's a lot that we can do in terms of access and partnership with a number of organizations here, and we are really close to developing those kinds of priorities of where do we need to spend our time and effort. The classic example, that we share is, say fish in a lake or a stream, where that lake or stream has been warming, where the native fish are no longer able to live in any sort of sustainable way because of this warming. Understanding when those tipping points are and mobilizing our knowledge systems as Indigenous people as to when, where, and how to, say, stock that river or that stream or lake with non-native species of fish to support our first foods development is so critical to our future. And I would say, we are facing similar challenges here, just in terms of for a couple of the tribal nations with water supply issues, and sort of not thinking about just next year or even in 10 years, like how do we develop a water supply system in partnership with others who are also suffering by a lack of quality water, thinking about those 7 generations. So we're really on the cusp of a lot of great work to develop these sort of climate change adaptation plans, but also reorienting the landscape towards Indigenous management and stewardship.
For Marama, I might ask you this question. We have a question from one of the audience members who says, I'm keen to hear and understand First Nations perspectives on how we can manage migration, particularly climate refugees in the long term, which we know is projected to be a huge issue in the Pacific.
Oh gosh, I'll be honest, this is not my speciality. We do have a very large Pacific people's community in Auckland. We have people from Tokelau and from Tuvalu coming to New Zealand because their islands are, they are not sinking, but they are being, the rising sea level is making it so there is no water there anymore, and they don't have much land. And I don't know about managing these types of things. I mean, my feeling is if someone, it's a different thing in New Zealand. We don't have islands where we hold people, not that I know of anyway. And my feeling is that my tupuna, my ancestors came here on a waka, and they found a place because where they came from, something wasn't right for them, or they could have just been extremely adventurous. And as a human being, I feel like if you can look after people and you can house them and home them, I would welcome them. I don't have any problem with sharing what I have with others. And some people have so much and they can share so much more. And I think as human beings living today, whether they come from the Pacific or whether they come from other places, you have to look after humanity and look after other people. But there can only be one tangata whenua, and those are the Māori. The autochthonous people of this nation were here first. And so I'm happy to share my country with others, but I want them to remember that Māori were the first people here.
Such a brilliant answer. I'm sure we could have many hours on that topic alone. We've got a few questions on in terms of policy and structures and grassroots movements as well. So I might sort of combine a few of those questions for you, Rodney. How do you see here in Victoria a potential treaty, the First Peoples Assembly, some of those debates around even a voice to Parliament, some of those structures that could be very new to us here in Australia? How could they assist in terms of healing country and taking up our concerns on climate change?
Yeah, so I'll probably defer to the other speakers tonight on their experiences around treaty, because our journey is just so young. But for Jaara Wurrung, treaty is an opportunity, I think, to have another conversation, and we're all aware that a treaty is just an agreement, and I don't say just in lightly. It's significant. It's significant in the way it's framed around what it's trying to redress, and to at least afford a people unfairly treated as a form of sovereign within that. And for us as Jaara Wurrung, we see that as extremely important. Ironically, our recognition settlement agreement with the state does everything but call us sovereign people. So it's unusual in a recognition statement, the way that's framed. The way that as a commercial agreement subject to company law, that it frees us as First Nations people from the committal of offences and legislation for activating our rights, access to natural resources. It tries to go beyond and position us for preference in a commercial environment, so for tenders, contracts, around social type weighting. So for my mind and for our people, we've discussed this and spoken to the 11 local governments on our homelands that for us a treaty maybe is the next evolution of our recognition settlement agreement, and we're extremely well placed, I think, to have that conversation and would want others to learn from it. But the First Peoples Assembly we've got here in Victoria still has some challenges around creating the framework, the fund and the regulator, I guess, around treaties. So we can only wish them really well and to try and be positive, given that we understand that most treaties around the world have been broken in one way or another.
Yes. Yeah, they're certainly not a silver bullet, are they? Darren, your perspective on that, because you do understand treaties in a way that we don't here in Australia because we don't have them.
Yeah, so it's such an important question. I mean, I think the articulation of our rights, for us, our first treaties, I think like a lot of other Indigenous people are with our non-human relations. And then, our earliest treaties with European colonizers starting in the 17th century. And I was just yesterday out on a shoot for a film, that will help young people understand some of these histories of treaty. And we visited sort of key sites of treaty signings and, this focus on our, again, our access for first foods. The English figured out early on that they wanted to build their forts around things that we call sites of sustenance, right? Falls or heads of tide, things that are, rich in resources. And that's what they wanted to do was disrupt our access to those things. So, when I think of that and the promise of those treaties framed by our diplomacies as Indigenous people, and then I look at, again, the inability of state and national governments to maintain their promises in these historic treaties. And then I look at sort of these modern treaties, and there's a real disconnect, right? If we look at the framework for, the Paris Accords, really are not recognizing the unique roles and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples. We're being grouped with local communities in these international accords around climate and biodiversity. And, there's a real need to transform these institutions and sort of the international context to really highlight and recognize Indigenous people's rights. And I would say, like, to me, that shift in the structure is really critical to the future of human beings on this planet, so that the leadership, the infrastructure, the way we engage in adapting to climate change, mitigating climate change, we're at a real risk that Indigenous people won't be at those important seats of decision making as we move forward.
Well, we're flying through our hour, unfortunately. So I might ask a final question of our panel. We've got a question here from an audience member, which I think is a really nice way to finish, given we're at the Future Forums. Looking forward, what climate actions or projects or or fights are you most optimistic about in terms of creating change? Rodney, what gives you some hope?
It's a bit overwhelming sometimes on a good day when you think about it. I think just to have us today, our future generations, positioned with some respect and authority in what happens going forward. I always think that there's never enough of us to doing everything, to do all. So our partnerships and our relationships are really important. And I think for corrective or restorative measures potentially on country around the impacts of climate change actually needs a lot of people on ground potentially to be doing things, and that's not always easily activated. And I really agree with the comment earlier on. We need more of our own, our children, their children, to study academically and become scholars in their own right, and to be part of a cohort of peers going forward that they're equal and they're respected and they're the new leaders of the future, that hopefully we leave them a better future for them to build upon.
Marama, what gives you some hope looking forward? You've already spoken about the amazing cohort of new Māori scholars. What else gives you some optimism?
Within my cohort of scholars that I work with, I also have non-Māori scholars in there who also bring so much to our scholarship. You know, we have legal experts and we have oral historians, and so it's actually bringing like-minded people together with a shared vision of a better, or of working with local communities, because we don't want to take away their, we use the word mana in Māori, but we don't want to take away their authority and power, but we want to be a part of their projects. We want to listen to them and learn from them, but it's important that we get our students out of the classroom and out of the universities and into environments where they can learn and, we just create those sorts of opportunities where Māori can be involved in their future. And it's just about bringing the right people together, as Darren said, or it's about relationships and creating good relationships that are honourable and trustworthy, and that you have a shared vision of wanting this, wanting to survive and wanting to pass something on to those future generations. And I think the thing that I'm a scholar at a university, and it's my obligation to make sure that I pull up the ladder, or bring through as many good Māori scholars and good other scholars as well as I possibly can while I'm at the university. So that's the contribution that I can make, doing good research with new minds.
New generation. Darren, what excites you about the future? What are you looking forward to, and what makes you optimistic, even in a time where we are so worried about climate change?
Yeah, and again, I'll talk global, even though I just said that globally we're really behind the ball, and we're not meeting the institutional challenges. I will say that the glimmer of hope that came out of the last Conference of Parties meeting for the Paris Accords was some agreement on forest protection that really centered Indigenous stewardship and made a really strong commitment that they would not repeat the mistakes of past climate accords that meant that Indigenous people were kicked out of forests and not included in the infrastructure to support and develop sustainable forests moving forward. So internationally, that's a nice glimmer of hope, and I really do think our ability to as Indigenous people here in our region, across the landscape with land trusts. I'm super hopeful of that work. I think there is a shift here in North America around recognizing that conservation groups and land trusts need a different frame to be relevant. And in that, there can be some real honest agreements and perspectives where Indigenous leadership can really influence the way that conservation groups and land trusts do their work. So to me, that's a very, very significant shift, and that creates some really amazing hope for me moving forward, that we would have more land returned to us, we would have more roles of stewardship across our territory, and that we would be able to sustain ourselves through First Foods because of all of these networks.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to finish our evening. Unfortunately, our hour is up. It's never enough, but thank you so much to our panel, Darren, Rodney and Marama. A round of applause for them. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions. The time went very quickly, but thank you so much for engaging in tonight's panel. And Museums Victoria would also like you to give them some feedback on tonight's event. There'll be a survey available that you can fill out, so that'd be great if you could do that. Thanks so much.